Welcome to our daily talks today. This is our last week of the session, and we're actually going to be talking about preparing the workplace for immediate and evolving needs as companies and employees return to work. We will be featuring James Segil, president and co-founder of Openpath, as well as Arnold Levin, regional consulting practice area leader at Gensler. They will speak and present for about 20 minutes, and then we will have a live Q&A for about 10 minutes. Thank you for joining us today, James and Arnold.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, can you all see my screen okay?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, then I'll just start us off. Chelsea, thanks for the introduction. Arnold, it is always a pleasure to see you. We've been able to give this talk a number of times to different folks, both prospects, customers, industry groups, and we're delighted to be here and share the perspectives that we have both at Openpath and at Gensler with various sort of challenges and changes of this new world order, right? So we're going to go through a bit of a framework introducing kind of some of the thinking that we've been going through as we try to organize our timing for return to work strategies. And then the Gensler team, led by Arnold, has put some really impressive creative thought together about ways that you can adapt the workplace, both in short term and long term, to this new normal that we're getting into. And then, of course, we'll discuss some of the questions and topics that we've been debating and then open it up for Q&A. So I'll jump in. If you take a look today at how we have sort of thought about the return to work plans, we kind of broken things down into this framework of 4 different phases. Phase 1 is what we're kind of coming out of right now. This is that shelter in place, flatten the curve, everybody go on to quarantine lockdown. Now, the country is starting to open up again, although carefully and slowly. And there's these kind of shifting waves of behavior that we're seeing manifest in the workplace, in the world, and in sort of commercial businesses opening up. And all of that will sort of ebb and flow until we get to this phase 3, which is where we're post-vaccine, post sort of pre-immunity, right? Where we have a way to determine that people have antibodies, effective testing. There is a vaccine that's now getting distributed, but it takes a while to get to a point where the population has 50% herd immunity so that we're actually pretty safe. And then, of course, we move to that phase 4, which is whatever the new normal is going to be and kind of prepared for the next pandemic. And look, we've already experienced this emotional and political kind of pendulum where certain geographies open up, others are still closed. They open up and then they close. And then there's these emotional reactions as everybody who's been cooped up is excited to get out and realizes, yikes, we're infecting one another and the infection rates go up, let's go back in. And so it's like a roller coaster ride, right? You go out, you stay in, you go out, you stay in. And this is going to be how things are for a while. Infection rates kind of swing up and swing down. We've seen this now in Arizona. We've seen this across the US and different places as they opened up and then quickly kind of pulled back. What does this mean for employers? And because we think about things, obviously, from the perspective of real estate, from the built world perspective. And this means that employers are now starting to put policies in place that maintain, temperature checks, perform sort of health screening prior to getting into the workplace, increase the use of disinfection and sanitation, and still have a fairly reduced business travel. But there's a lot of investments that are being made in the built world in preparation for return to work. This is where Openpath really focuses our attention on a day-to-day basis. We make hands-free access control so that you can walk up to a door, wave your hand, combine that with an automatic door opener, and you don't have to touch anything in order to get into your office. So folks are deploying this kind of technology, as well as additional cleaning stations, all kinds of congestion-free lobby layouts, touchless elevator capabilities, health screening and monitoring, all kinds of different tools. And so we see this investment being made. The big question that comes up amongst both tenants and landlords is who's going to pay for all this? And as that debate has ensued, we've seen that rent revenue has been impacted by COVID. owners of properties are kind of struggling to meet the debt covenants that they have to, keep up. And then those lenders are having to turn around and reduce their yields to their investors. Does that mean foreclosures or government funds or relief capital coming in? Or does it just mean that there's a shared lift that tenants and owners together are going to sort of expend to get the built world ready for post-COVID? And the judgment that people have to sort of look at is what is a long-term investment and then what is a short-term investment? If I put cleaning stations in, will I need them for a long time? If I'm changing the load in and load out approach to my building, do I need that with stickers and guards, or can I do it through automation? Are there technologies I can put in place to update and upgrade my elevators, my people moving technology, my security systems that will help me with this? And I think that the overall analysis has been that it's going to be a shared expense between owners and landlords and the occupiers. They're just going to basically find a way to do it together. We've been rolling out a huge number of solutions really focused on safety and wellness, whether it's the hands-free access or just the ability to actually enforce wellness verifications, where prior to actually showing up at work, you fill out a screening health attestation on your mobile phone. And if you filled it out correctly, it actually enables your mobile access credential on your phone and you can enter work. If you haven't filled it out or you put in that you're sick, it denies you access. We do the same with occupancy management integration so that you can limit capacities of different rooms, both with visual screens as well as enforcement, so that once you surpass the capacity of that room, it kind of locks the door and doesn't let someone in until someone leaves. Fever detection, we can discuss, touchless elevator and contact tracing are all additional themes that people have been evaluating as they sort of evaluate return to work. Well, let me hand it over to Arnold, and Arnold, I'll drive, so just tell me when to click next, and let's talk about some of the things that you guys are thinking about at Gensler.
Sure, thanks, James. So, working off of what James was talking about, we've gone through these three phases. What's interesting is, if we had been doing this presentation, which James and I have done before, 2 months ago, we would have been talking about, helping organizations, deal with, with working virtually, working from home. Most of us and most of the world has gone from a world of physical work to a world of virtual work. In about a month's time, we began, talking to clients about re-entering the workplace, the things that James was focusing on. What do we need to do to prepare to get back into a workplace that we know is not going to be 100% occupied, that we know is going to have protocols and policies in place, both in terms of the amount of staff that can be allowed, but also the protocols around health and fit and wellness. But the past month, we've seen a shift in the conversation, to, what does the workplace look like, 2 years from now? Organizations that are in the process of thinking about reevaluating their current status and their current workplace really want to learn from what we're going through today, what we've gone through over the past 3 months, to what does that future look like? What we're calling the reimagined future. Next, James. So, we do a series of roundtables, across all of our, 40 some odd offices. And, we're gathering a lot of insight in terms of, what's concerning, most of the clients, globally. We've got the advantage of having offices, in 41 locations globally. And we get different perceptions based upon, where you are geographically and where you are in the timeline of this pandemic. But we also, see that there's some commonalities. People recognize the need for innovation so that organizations, can be viable enterprises. I think, one of the things that we did do research on, we found that those organizations that were successfully able to make the leap from the physical to the virtual had two things going for them. They had the ability of ubiquitous technology, but they also had an organizational structure that allowed them to be much more agile. And what we're seeing in talking to clients is that going forward, whether it's in the reentry process, but more importantly in this reimagined world, organizations are going to need to change and become less hierarchical and much more team-based in order to be successful, in order to be able to achieve resilience. But also people want to be safe. We think that, one of the outcomes of this pandemic is that this is the first crisis that we face globally that has a psychological factor, that despite all the great technology that we have and the ability to be able to do things for hands-free travel, we also know that there's going to be a shadow over everybody in terms of the psychological impact that this is going to have in terms of both the physical safety but also the psychological safety going forward. And lastly, people want their communities to be able to adapt and create change based on this experience, and not look at this as a stopgap method that's just etched in time for 2 years. It's about what can we learn from this experience that we could take into this reimagined future. Next. So again, one of the biggest changes that we see in the world of facilities, is that decisions are going to be made by a much broader, corporate real estate team. Typically the work that we do, while we do get to work with presidents and CEOs, it's often, not often enough. And typically what we're seeing now, because of the nature of this crisis, is that facility managers, corporate real estate executives are going to be joined by executives from HR and from the corporate C-suite, because people are seeing for the first time that there's a strong connection between the physical workplace, the work that's being done, and how that impacts the organization. Next. So, we created this timeline in terms of, how do we look, and how do we work with organizations to go through this process? And so there's really three components. There's the people and the protocols assessment in terms of, what do you need to be able to do to get back to work first, but also what's going to become long lasting, dealing with temperature monitoring, dealing with, testing for the virus, what happens with childcare if your office is open, but your child's school is still closed. Cleaning and hygiene are going to become critical issues. And we all know that we're going to be living with social distancing at least for, 2 years, and potentially the impact of that, into the future. Travel and commuting, if you live in New York City, Chicago, San Francisco, or London, public transportation, is the mode that people take. How are we going to be able to deal with that? The second piece of this thing, which I think is often being overlooked in the conversation, and we think is equally important to the physical, are the organizational changes that businesses and enterprises are going to need to undertake to be successful going forward, whether it's in the immediate reentry process or whether it's in this future reimagined process. The employee experience needs to be looked at, beyond the physical, and to really to be able to expand, to the psychological and the wellness experience. But it's also about empowering teams. As I said earlier, we think that organizations are going to have to change their model from a much more hierarchical structured model to one that's much more agile in order to be able to adapt to the changes that are going to come over the next couple of years. But it's also about ubiquitous technologies, the technology that we've seen in what James shared, and that's going to become critical. But in addition to those types of technologies, it's also about, digital and how do we connect, to be able to do, conferencing without being in the same room as your teammates. And the third part is how does that then begin to play out, into viable strategies for a place. And it really is all about redefining, what work is, where work is done, and what the role of the workplace is. Next. So again, there's, considerations, building off of this in terms of, in the immediate reentry process, it really is all about signage and wayfinding. How do you avoid the bottlenecks so that you're allowed to be able to have social distancing, for instance, elevators, and how do we deal with, getting into a building? If you've got a garage that's under your building, how do you cue people to get from the garage, into the main lobby and then up into your office suite? Indoor outdoor spaces, become very different in terms of how do we perceive that. We recognize that the ability to have outdoor space and natural air, is a good barrier for the spread of the virus, as opposed to being able to just be inside. And so in certain climates like Southern California, you have the luxury of being able to create much more integration between those two types of spaces. And then it's obviously, it's about, dealing with indoor air quality as well, and how do we upgrade mechanical systems. Next. We know that magic 6 feet, which is not as magic as we all think it is, it could be 10 feet, but social distancing, is going to have the strongest impact with the reentry process. But we also believe that it's also going to call into question in the reimagined future, do we go back to a world that has been as dense as we've been living in the past? We know that over the past 10 years, we've gone from an average square foot per person of around 275 square feet down to 115 square feet. Will those days come back? I don't think that the old normal, where densification, was the hallmark and benchmark of how we design workplaces, is where we will ever go back. And I think that the big takeaway from this pandemic is that we are going to be totally reevaluating in the future what we think about the workplace and what the role of the workplace is, that will allow us not to have to go back to that kind of dense, cramming in of people into the workplace. Next. So again, building entries become huge issues in terms of, how do you get into a building? Are we going to put barriers into buildings like turnstiles, like, most buildings in New York City have, in order to be able to slow people down and avoid people congregating before they even get into an elevator? Once you get into the elevator, you may not be able to have more than 2 people. If you're on the 50th floor of a high rise in Chicago, it could take you a couple of hours to get back up into your office location. And so how do we phase people to go in and out of office buildings, to avoid that kind of backlog? Next. So again, one of the things that we see in terms of looking at the future, and this is where we're, working with our clients now, is that there's a real connection between how they define work, where that work takes place, but also what happens within the organization. How do you reinvent not just the workplace, but your business enterprise as well? Next. So, we see that there's this integration in terms of a number of components that really need to be taken into consideration, from your organizational design to how you define the employee experience, to be able to create fluidity of spaces. Workplace culture becomes a huge area. If your culture, is not collaborative, you're going to have a very difficult time in this new world. And how do you develop collaboration methods that take into account both real-time collaboration in place physically, but also continuing the virtual collaboration that all of us are doing, as we can see by this webinar? And then how do you measure success? What's the criterion? So we think organizations are going to have to develop a whole new set of metrics going forward in terms of how they measure the success of their workplace and their real estate component. Next. So one of the things that we did do is, we wanted to create some hypotheticals in terms of what does this future look like, and so we developed, 4 functional, areas that we think, have potential going forward: seasonal mobility, functional mobility, the office as an engagement hub, and then the hyper-private workspace. Next. So again, the seasonal mobility, are for, if your office and your workplace is in an area, that's continually impacted by seasonal disruptions. And we know that disruptions across the environment, from sustainability issues, to technology, is increasing. And so you basically use your workplace at the times when, the season is not as volatile. For instance, if you're in Southern California, fire season. We know how disruptive that has been. And so you bring your workforce into the workplace, when it's not volatile, and you keep them at home working the way they've been doing over the past 3 months. This allows organizations to be able to, spread the workforce out over time, and it changes based upon the geography and the climate, where you live. Next one. We also see that, and we're already seeing this one with a lot of our clients in terms of, what we're calling functional team mobility. That as you begin to adapt a more agile organizational model that's much more team-based, you begin to rotate people to come into the office. Again, this enables you not to have to take more real estate than what you can afford, because you're not going to be as dense as you were 6 months ago. And so you could bring team A in, for 2 weeks, and have the rest of your teams, working at home, and then you begin to rotate that on either a project basis or a cycle basis, based on a time frame that suits the type of work that's being done. The third one, which is next, we're also seeing, and I think this has a lot more potential and really can totally, shake up the whole world of real estate and work, is you reconsider what the actual physical workplace is all about. We've learned over the past couple of months that people, in most part, can successfully work at home to do focus work. But what happens if the physical workplace just becomes a hub of collaboration, engagement, allowing, it's the place where you bring people to embed the brand and the culture of the organization. It's where you meet with clients and vendors. But to do focus work, why should you spend the money on real estate to come in to do heads down work, and you allow your workforce to be able to work from home? We're seeing this with many organizations that we're totally, shaking up, what a corporate headquarters is, from a facility of multiple buildings where everybody's coming into work and doing collaboration, to basically creating these hubs where you come into the physical workplace to do collaboration. Next. And the last one is, some organizations may not be comfortable unless they are in a private office environment. And so we could see an increase in private offices, albeit smaller ones. And this one would necessitate just the reverse of the third scenario, where you would need potentially a lot more real estate to be able to accommodate your workforce. Next.
There we go. Well, we covered a lot, so I know that there's a lot of meat on these bones. I did want to make sure that if folks do have questions, they take a moment to ask. Sorry. Also wanted to make sure that you had our contact information if you need to get a hold of us at some point. But maybe you want me to sort of stop the slide share at this point and hand it back to you, Chelsea?
Yeah, sure. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A section. I'd love to start out by asking you a question. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about some specific projects that you guys are working on in the market?
Sure.
Go for it, Arnold.
Okay. So, if you think back to that third scenario that I shared, we're working with a large health insurance organization in Arizona, where they had originally hired us back in September to do an analysis of their 500,000 square feet, 5-building campus. They knew that they were, it was underoccupied in terms of the amount of time people were actually spending in their workplace. And they wanted us to do an analysis for them and develop a new workplace strategy. We found at the time they were, not unlike most organizations, not occupying the space 8 hours a day. And in fact, occupancy across 500,000 square feet, came to about 30% of the day. People were in meetings, people were traveling between buildings, people were, working off site. And so, along with that analysis, and some, shifts and changing of their organizational model, we had recommended that they adapt a much more, agile workplace model with desk sharing, which brought them down to about 340,000 square feet of space. When we were doing the final presentation to the CEO back in April, the CEO said to me, we've got 99% of our people successfully working from home over the past 2 months. What happens if we keep 60% of our workforce to be able to allow them to work at home? How would that change our thinking about the corporate headquarters? And so, we did an evaluation, and got them down to about 270,000 square feet of space, where their headquarters basically is a convening center, where again, the reason to come into the workplace and into the physical office is to collaborate, to get training, to embed culture. And so they've totally shifted because of the pandemic. They're thinking about the role of the workplace as opposed to the workplace being able to accommodate multiple activities, from focus work to collaboration to socializing and that type of thing. They're now looking at the workplace primarily as a place of collaboration.
So 2 additional sort of things to share. If you take a look at our customers, we see different folks that are using our technologies. If you look at property owners, especially in commercial office buildings, their buildings have been open this whole time, and obviously not a lot of people are in them, but they've certainly been open. And so now, as companies are bringing their employees back to work, I think the key thing that folks are looking for is a way to enforce some of the policies that people really want in place to make them feel safe. So what we have seen are a number of buildings that are mandating these health screening sort of self-attestments. And so some of our portfolio partners who we work with, who have large real estate portfolios, have put technology in place like mobile apps or kiosks at each of the buildings to allow the tenants to have a way to, sort of self-attest that, hey, I don't have the temperature this morning, I've not been exposed, and that, puts a level of safety in there that's not too cumbersome and not too overbearing. Something else that has been kind of interesting is that, we've been tracking all of the stats on a national basis. So as I share my screen here, you can see on the Openpath website, we have a return to works sort of index. That's called our social distancing index. And you can find it at openpath.com/social distancing. And we track the return to work on a national basis based on the number of door unlocks that we're seeing occur across our network. And we have over, a couple thousand buildings with, literally 10,000 plus doors and 250,000 users. So what's really interesting is, as you see on an industry vertical perspective, obviously these charts, these numbers are starting to really go back up, and government is getting back to work, commercial businesses are, but as you might imagine, houses of worship, schools, gyms are still relatively slow. And so obviously, there's a certain hesitancy that's appropriate to go into certain shared spaces, but a lot of America is really starting to get back to work now. And you can see that also on a state-by-state basis here, some dramatic shifts and swings in certain states, whereas other states are kind of gradually, opening up a little bit compared to before. So I'll sort of hand the screen back now.
Yeah, we actually do have some questions for you guys. Gabriella Greiger asks, how much freedom do employers give employees to choose where they want to work from? Does it differ by industry function from what you see? Will eating in cafeterias, food delivery what will that look like now with everything going on?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll take a quick stab. So what we've seen is that you have to time shift the part of the day that you go eat, right? Because if you're in a skyscraper and everybody tries to leave at noon to go to lunch, you're going to have a hard time getting an elevator ride down when there's capacity constraints there. And frankly, you're going to have a hard time getting served at the cafeteria or at the cafe or at the restaurant. We've seen also a lot of folks put in storage locker areas in the base building as a way to have delivery drop-off zones, so that the delivery drivers and the delivery people don't have to actually get into the building and go upstairs, which reduces congestion on the elevators as well, and has people sort of consolidating their pickup downstairs. I don't know, what are you seeing different things as well, Arnold?
No, I mean, we're seeing that, but we're also seeing, it somewhat varies, from not necessarily industry to industry, but from organization to organization and geography to geography. I mean, the way organizations are handling the situation in areas that were, had higher impact, with the virus, like the large cities like, New York and Chicago and Los Angeles are different than some of the smaller cities, that at least initially weren't as impacted, though we're seeing, as you noted earlier, areas like Phoenix, which were, low on the list, are now, increasing. And so, the things that we know for sure are that with social distancing as a mandate over the next, 2 years probably, we are going to have shifts coming in into office buildings, just so that you don't get, lines of people out the door waiting to get into an elevator and that type of thing. One of the things that hasn't been addressed that we're talking to clients to make sure they're aware of is, we're dealing with how do you get people into the building, but how do you get people out of the building? What happens when, people begin to leave at 4:30 and everybody's queuing up, for elevators? And I think, those issues really haven't been addressed as enough. I think food service, which was part of that question, for the next couple of years, is going to be very limited. I think we're not going to see, the cafeterias, and the food service, that some large organizations have, in full operation. It's going to be, very similar to what we see, with Starbucks to a certain degree, where, they've closed all their indoor seating. If you've got outdoor seating and you're in a climate, that allows for that, that will happen. But I think they're going to be limiting the types of food service that you get, to more of a grab and go type of situation over the next, year and a half, 2 years.
Thank you, James and Arnold, for answering that. We have two more questions. Joanne McCarter asks, you touched on culture. Do you think that working from home will have a negative impact on company cultures, especially for new starters? And do you have any suggestions for this?
I think that's a great question, and in fact, that that example that I gave, 2 questions ago from that company, in Arizona, one of the things that they're, while they're quick to really realize that they could work virtually from home, one of their concerns is how do we maintain culture if we keep our workforce from home? I think there's going to have to be a lot more of a concerted effort on the part of organizations to be able to think and rethink to some degree, how do you embed culture? It may not be as, serendipitous as it was when everybody was coming to the workplace, and you build off of the culture from your colleagues and from your teammates. And so when the workplace is being used for collaboration, there's going to be an emphasis on managers to be able to make sure, that meetings are actually held as often as possible in the workplace, to be able to bring people, into a physical place to be able to do that. But they're also going to have to come up with means to be able to make sure that as you work more virtually, and I think we are going to see the majority of organizations maintaining a split and a hybrid workforce, in terms of, how do you take the culture that you currently have and make that work in a world that's virtual and not necessarily physical. It's doable, and we're working with a lot of clients, to give them the policies and the protocols to be able to allow them to maintain a culture and to build a culture, particularly if you're a startup, which becomes, much more of a challenge. But it's doable, but it means, that you really need to do an analysis of your organizational model, your management techniques, and all that type of thing.
So as a startup in this space, I'm dealing with this real time. So I have 75 employees all over the US. And for the last 2.5 weeks, I am making, 5 or 6 calls a day and have, a half-hour sort of Slack, Zoom video chat with every single one of my employees. And I have not done that really for the past 2 months. It's been, all my direct reports and sort of dealing with, stuff going on. And I wanted to get a sense of how people were doing, given the dramatic changes that have happened to this country and this world over the last couple of weeks. And also, the sort of lock-in quarantine depression that affects everybody. So it was eye-opening, and it has been, it's been wonderful because I've got a chance to really talk to people and hear what's going on in their lives. And the things that I've seen that I was surprised of is that there's no separation between work and life anymore. People don't know how to separate because you're always in front of your computer, you're a remote knowledge worker, you can't kind of separate. And so it turns out that my company is benefiting in terms of productivity, but my employees, I think, for the most part, are suffering a little because they're not separating, they're not taking time off and vacation, they're not out traveling because they can't. I think there's a lot of depression, anger, frustration. Those are the negative things that have happened both because of COVID and being quarantined and shut in, and also because of a lot of things that going on in life, whether it's sickness or, tension in the world between everything that's happening. And so, just having the ability to just talk one-on-one with people and understand what's going on has made an impact in our culture. I was happy to see that all my line managers are in day-to-day contact with their teams and have their finger on the pulse and know what's going on. I asked a question of every single one of my employees at the end of each call, which is, who needs a little extra love right now? Like, who do you know as a coworker or a colleague who you're working with every day, who you just want me to keep an eye on? And that's been eye-opening as well, because everybody's thinking about and caring about their colleagues as well. And now I kind of made that a little bit more sort of front of mind. But I don't know if there's a formula for success. And to Arnold's point, it's based on the size of the company that you have and the quality of the people and the sort of job that they do. But I will tell you this, developing those techniques and capabilities is going to be basically what makes you successful and makes you fail over the next year. And so we are, leaning in very much on trying to come up with a roadmap and a methodology for managing people remotely and keeping them, as part of the culture.
Thank you, James. And so one more question before we wrap it up. Ivan Sala asks, do you think that co-working spaces could be a good fit as a solution and support system for the third scenario? So office as a brand and culture hub.
Okay, so I've seen flex space, really sort of step up in terms of the ability to give short-term support to remote workers who need to get out of the house, but can't necessarily commute in to where their offices are located because public transportation was their method of getting in and they can't use that because of fear around COVID, or frankly, they can't afford to be that far away from home given childcare responsibilities or a host of other things. And so having flex space that they can work with other folks and collaborate and not be at home and not be distracted, I've seen has serious value. I don't know if the legacy design and layout of most co-working spaces is exactly optimized for what the new normal needs, but I have to imagine that those co-working spaces are evolving their footprint to accommodate that as well. And there certainly is ample capacity. I think part of it ties into the move or the movement that I've seen towards suburban space in the short term as a way for corporations to house their employees in a work environment that's not home, but not have them commute into the city. So I do think there's a role for co-working solutions right now. What are you seeing, Arnold?
No, I totally agree. I think that while most organizations are reluctant to put a lot of money into redesigning their workplaces for the short term and are doing sort of makeshift adaptions in terms of taking every other seat out of conference rooms, of eliminating every other desk. 2 years of that, begins to, sort of wear on the organization. I think, one of the advantages of co-working spaces, is that they are able to redo their workspace to make it much more accommodating, for the next couple of years, to be able to allow organizations to rent space. And the other advantage is that you could rent space, on an as-needed basis, where you don't have to deal with, 5-year lease terms. So there's a lot of advantages for organizations, to be able to look at flex space, co-working, WeWork type spaces, as a substitute, for their current workplace because of the flexibility. And they've also got that internal flexibility to be able to, redesign their workplace in a short period of time, because of how they were set up originally.
Awesome. Well, thank you, James and Arnold, for your time today. It was such a pleasure having you guys on our daily talks. And everyone, hope you guys learned something from this session, and hopefully we'll all be back in the office soon enough.
Thanks very much, Chelsea.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Chelsea.
Bye-bye.